Okay, hi everyone, this is lecture 6, Intro to Metabolism. So before we get started going into specific metabolic processes, we're going to kind of lay the foundations for some of the ideas and concepts behind metabolism. So hopefully this helps. So these are the learning objectives. Again, these can always be found online. You can use these kind of as a study guide as we go through each lecture and what you should hopefully be able to do in practice. Okay, so part 1, energy. So energy is used by living things, and it demonstrates the different laws of thermodynamics. So energy used by living things demonstrates the first law of thermodynamics, which is that energy can be transferred and transformed, but not created or destroyed. And it also demonstrates the second law of thermodynamics. So the conversion of energy to thermal energy released as heat by living things demonstrates that second law of thermodynamics. And that second law says that every energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy or disorder of the universe. So here's an example from the textbook. So the first law of thermodynamics is kind of outlined on the left, and then the second law on the right. So remember that the first law says energy can be transferred and transformed, but not created or destroyed. So just focusing on the first law, the light energy that comes from the sun gets transformed by plants into chemical energy in the organic molecules in plants. So that happens through photosynthesis, which we'll talk about in a future lecture. And in this example, they're focusing on termites. So then the chemical energy from the molecule in plants gets transformed by termites into chemical energy in organic molecules in the termites. And then it gets transformed again by the beetle larvae to produce energy, like in the form of light energy formed by bioluminescence. So that's showing how energy can be like just transferred or transformed, but not created or destroyed. And then the second law of thermodynamics is that every energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy or disorder of the universe. And so that's shown on the right. So at different stages of these different processes, some energy is lost to the environment as heat. It's not destroyed, but it's kind of just lost to the environment. It can't be 100% captured from one form to the next. So some energy is lost to the environment as heat at the different stages. So let's go back. What is metabolism and what is energy? So metabolism is the totality of an organism's chemical reactions. So there's hundreds of thousands of chemical reactions happening inside of an organism. So the metabolism is all of the different reactions, the totality of all of them. So in a metabolic pathway, a specific molecule is altered in a series of steps to make a product. And each step is catalyzed or like helped to happen by a specific enzyme. And an enzyme is a macromolecule, usually a protein, that speeds up a specific reaction. So this is kind of like the long and short of this entire lecture. We're going to talk about the different energy forms and chemical reactions, how enzymes work to speed up chemical reactions, and that's going to lay the foundation for all of the other actual processes like cellular respiration, fermentation, photosynthesis. So each step in a metabolic pathway is catalyzed by a specific enzyme. A specific molecule, you start with a molecule and it gets altered in a series of steps. Even though we're going to show the big picture equations for these different processes, like cellular respiration, we're going to show you an overall reaction and equation. But it's actually a whole bunch of series of steps. So you start out with a specific molecule, one enzyme catalyzes one specific reaction, and now there's this intermediate molecule. A second enzyme helps catalyze a specific reaction, and now this molecule is slightly altered into another intermediate. And then at the very end, you have the products of this whole metabolic pathway. So even though we're going to show like a big picture equation for cell respiration or photosynthesis, it's actually a whole bunch of steps. And each small step is made easier to happen by a specific enzyme. So at the end of this lecture, the last part is going to be focusing on just enzymes, and that's why it's a big part of all these different processes. So there are different kinds of metabolic pathways based on if you're making something or breaking something. So catabolic pathways end up releasing energy by breaking down complex molecules into simpler compounds. So, for example, when we're going to talk about the process of cellular respiration, this is a catabolic pathway because you're breaking down a bigger complex molecule, glucose, into simpler compounds, and then this is going to end up releasing energy. So cellular respiration is going to be a catabolic pathway. You're breaking something down complex into simpler parts. On the other hand, anabolic pathways is like the opposite. You're building complex molecules, but that takes energy. So anabolic pathways consume energy to build complex molecules from simpler ones. And so in this case, an example would be a synthesis of protein from the amino acids. You take all these amino acids and then you put them together, but that takes energy. Catabolic pathways are considered downhill reactions because they release energy. It doesn't take an input of energy. It's kind of something that's going to happen or more likely to happen on its own. So for example, if you have a ball at the top of a hill and you roll it downhill, it's a lot easier, right? It just kind of can happen on its own. You're not pushing the ball down the hill. It's kind of just like once you start it, it goes. So that's a catabolic pathway. Anabolic pathways are uphill. You have to put in energy to make this thing happen. So in this sense, it's kind of like you're at the bottom of the hill and you have to roll the ball up the hill. So it's taking energy that way. So anabolic pathways are uphill reactions. So your cells have these two different kinds of reactions happening, some that like release energy and some that take energy. So living things will use the energy released from the downhill reactions of catabolic pathways to power the uphill reactions of anabolic pathways. And that's really what you're gonna see as a pattern in these processes that we learn about in the next few lectures is that some reactions are going to be taking up energy. You might have to put like an investment of a little bit of energy, but other parts are going to end up releasing energy. So yeah, living things use them in combination to drive each other. And so bioenergetics is the study of how the energy flows through living organisms. Okay, so what is energy? So energy is the capacity to cause change, and that energy can be used to do work. In other words, move matter against opposing forces like gravity and friction. And some of this might sound familiar if you have started taking either the chemistry series or physics series. A lot of times as a bio major, you'll have to take chem and physics. And sometimes it's like, why? But it really does all play a part in biology. It all comes together. So yeah, if these, some of this stuff sounds familiar or you haven't taken them yet, you're probably going to hear about these concepts because it is all tied together. So energy is the capacity to cause change, and it can be used to do work, and the work can be different depending on what the situation is, like moving matter against opposing forces, like gravity and friction. And energy exists in various forms. So we're going to talk about some of the different ones here. And living cells must transform energy from one form to another to be able to do the work of life. So what are the different forms of energy? The first is kinetic energy. So kinetic energy is energy associated with motion. So if things are moving, it's having kinetic energy. Moving objects perform work by imparting motion to other matter. So for example, if there's like a dam, and then the water is, kind of like held up by the dam, and then water gushing through the dam helps turn turbines. And so that's an example that we're going to use later on in this lecture too. So when something's moving, it's giving motion to other things, and yeah. So water gushing through turbines turns the turbines, and that might be powering something else. So kinetic energy, motion. Thermal energy is the kinetic energy associated with random movement of atoms or molecules. And so thermal energy in transfer from one object to another is called heat. So like this coffee that's still a little bit warm has thermal energy because it's imparting transfer of thermal energy from the coffee to the cup and then from the cup to my hand. So that's technically what heat is the thermal energy in transfer from one object to another. And then light is another type of thermal energy that can be harnessed to do work, like in photosynthesis. So yeah, a lot of this stuff might seem kind of really out of context right now, but it will make sense because it's thermal energy that cells in plants use to power photosynthesis and then make chemical energy. Potential energy is energy that matter possesses because of its location or structure. So again, the example of water behind a dam, that has energy because it's being held in place. And if that dam wasn't there, the water would just kind of move, right, and follow this natural path. So when water is being held behind a dam, it has potential energy because of its altitude above sea level. And if you were to take away the dam, it would move down basically with gravity and then go to sea level. So there's potential energy in that kind of form, but even in the tiny molecules. So molecules possess energy due to the arrangement of electrons in bonds between their atoms. Again, all this stuff comes together. It's super interesting and also probably annoying if you hate these or are not a fan of these other fields as much, but you come to appreciate how it all is involved with biology. And so chemical energy is potential energy available for release in a chemical reaction. So more complex molecules like glucose are high in chemical energy because energy is released as they're broken down into simpler products. So there are super complex molecules, of course. We talk about starch and stuff like that, but glucose is still a pretty complex molecule. So glucose can be high in chemical energy because then the energy is released when they get broken down into even smaller products. And so energy can be converted from one form to another. So for example, chemical energy from food is used to perform the work of climbing up a diving platform. So say, I think this example, yes, is people diving into a lake. So chemical energy from the food that these people ate can be used to perform the work of climbing up a diving platform. The kinetic energy of muscle movement is then transformed into potential energy as the diver climbs higher above the water. And then that potential energy is then transformed to kinetic energy as the diver actually is falling. So as they're moving, it's kinetic energy, not just potential energy. So this is, yeah, an example of those transformations of energy. There's more potential energy up here because this person is kind of being, yeah, held up. Diving actually converts the potential energy into kinetic energy. And then when the diver is climbing back up, it's converting the kinetic energy to the muscle movement to potential energy. Yeah. So, thermodynamics is the study of energy transformations in a collection of matter. And so, we are in the universe and are made of matter. And so this kind of applies to us too. In isolated system, for example, the liquid in a thermos bottle, when it's like closed off and isolated from the environment, that kind of system is unable to exchange energy with its surroundings. In an open system, energy and matter can be transferred between the system and its surroundings. So organisms are open systems. We exist in, like the universe and our environments. There is different interchanges of energy between us and our environments. So organisms are open systems. They absorb energy from light or food and release heat and metabolic wastes like carbon dioxide that we breathe out to the surroundings. Okay, so coming back to the law of thermodynamics, according to the first law of thermodynamics, the energy of the universe is constant. Energy is kind of just transferred and transformed, but it cannot be created or destroyed. So the first law is also called the principle of conservation of energy. Because, there's still the same total energy in the universe. It's kind of just transformed into different forms. During every energy transfer or transformation, some energy is converted to thermal energy and lost as heat, becoming unavailable to do work. So it's not destroyed, but it's in the form of thermal energy and won't be available to do work. So according to the second law of thermodynamics, every energy transfer or transformation increases the entropy of the universe. And entropy is a measure of molecular disorder or randomness. So this is an example of both of those. The first law of thermodynamics saying that the chemical energy in the food is transformed into the chemical energy that now exists in the bear, and the ways that the bear's body is using this energy. And so now it can move and run, and it's converting this chemical energy into kinetic energy because it's moving. And then the second law of thermodynamics states that, like, as the bear is running, it's generating body heat and it's losing a little bit of the heat to the environment. And so in that way, it's kind of contributing to entropy. So technically, living organisms increase the disorder of their surroundings through their metabolism. The breakdown of food releases heat and small molecules like carbon dioxide that we breathe out. So we're kind of, contributing to disorder in our surroundings. Processes that increase the entropy of the universe can occur spontaneously. In science, some terms are very specific as to what they mean. Sometimes in daily life when we say something or somebody is like spontaneous, it's like they do stuff all of a sudden really fast. But that's not always the case in this use of the term. So spontaneous processes here occur without energy input. They can happen quickly or slowly. It's just that it's going to happen without energy input. It happens kind of on its own. So processes that decrease entropy are non-spontaneous. They require an input of energy. So cells were made of just atoms, right? And so cells create ordered structures from less organized starting materials. For example, the simple molecules are ordered into amino acids, and then those get assembled into polypeptides, and then those get assembled to like functional proteins. So we're very complex ordered structures that are non-spontaneous. It does require input of energy. So complex ordered structures are also produced from simpler starting materials at the organism level. And the increase in order inside living organisms is balanced out by the catabolic breakdown of organized forms of matter, releasing heat in small molecules. So remember, catabolic means like breaking down a bigger molecule and releasing energy. My favorite example or analogy, acronym, whatever it is to help you remember catabolic versus anabolic. Catabolic, like cats, they have to scratch their cat scratcher, and so they're getting some energy out. And then they are, making all these little tiny pieces from that cat scratcher. So catabolic breakdown is when you're breaking down something larger into smaller pieces and then releasing energy. So even though our cells and our bodies are kind of making ordered molecules, it's kind of balanced out because we do also have the catabolic breakdown of other forms of matter, releasing heat in small molecules. And then on like a even larger scale, if we're not just focusing on one organism, in the big picture of like an ecosystem, energy comes into an ecosystem as light and then exits as heat. And so even though we are complex organisms and all of the things that are alive today kind of are seemingly more and more complex, the evolution of complex organisms from simpler ancestors doesn't really violate the second law technically because it's still increasing the entropy in the system. So entropy, again, is a measure of disorder, and it may decrease in a particular system, like in an organism, but it's still increasing the total entropy of the system and its surroundings. So as biologists, we can follow the energy and entropy changes during chemical reactions to help determine if they require an input of energy or if they occur spontaneously. So again, spontaneously doesn't just mean all of a sudden or fast. In the context of like energy and reactions, spontaneous means it happens without an input of energy. So, yeah, again, if you are going to take or if you have taken chemistry, this is going to come up. So Gibbs free energy is symbolized by just capital G. And so Gibbs free energy can be simplified and referred to as free energy. And free energy is the portion of a system's energy that can do work when temperature and pressure are uniform throughout the system, like in a living cell. So the change in free energy during a reaction is related to temperature and changes in enthalpy and entropy. So this haunts me. So remember, the capital G means free energy. And so this equation has a capital G, free energy, and this triangle. It's actually called the delta symbol. So the triangle delta means change in. So if there's that in front of a different symbol, it means change in whatever this is. So delta G is change in free energy. And that is equal to the change in enthalpy, which is symbolized by the H. And that's the total energy, minus T delta S. So T stands for temperature in Kelvin. Delta S means change in entropy. And so that is how you could calculate the total change in free energy based on changes related to temperature and enthalpy and entropy. What a nightmare, right? So you don't have to memorize this equation. This is not chemistry, don't worry. But just to kind of show you how things are related to other things. So changes in free energy are related to changes in temperature and entropy and enthalpy. But what we're really concerned right now is just the idea and changes of free energy, so delta G. So the delta G change in free energy for a process can be used to determine whether it is spontaneous or not. So if you do all these calculations and you get a value for delta G, if it's negative, then that means this process is spontaneous. You don't have to put in free energy. If it's negative, that means it's actually gonna release energy. So the change in free energy, or delta G, is negative for all spontaneous processes. And delta G is 0 or positive for non-spontaneous processes. This is saying you have to put in energy, a positive amount of energy, for this process to happen. So every spontaneous process decreases the system's free energy. And then spontaneous processes can be used and harnessed by the cell to end up performing work on other processes that are not spontaneous. So the change in free energy, or delta G, represents the difference between free energy of the final state and free energy of the initial state. So this equation tells you the change in free energy. If this is how much free energy is at the end, minus however much energy there was at the beginning, that's your change in free energy. So if a reaction has a negative delta G, then that means, the initial state had more than the final state, and then so there ends up being a loss in free energy on this system that you're focusing on. And this reaction ends up, losing free energy from the system, and then it becomes more stable. So free energy can also be thought of as a measure of a system's stability. Unstable systems tend to become more stable. So if there's a higher delta G, it's kind of unstable. And then it's going to want to become more stable. So something will happen to lower the free energy. So again, going back to the example of people on a lake, there's a diver on a platform. They are less stable when they're on the platform versus when they're floating in the water. If you think about a drop of dye that's really concentrated in water, you just drop the dye. It's less stable than when it gets dispersed through diffusion in that cup. Where a glucose molecule is less stable than the simpler molecules that it could be split into. So here's a picture of these examples. Basically, some things want to kind of happen because it's going to want to go from a higher state of instability to stability. I think especially if you think about diffusion, and we just covered that last week, right? So over time, things will become more stable. Okay. So, coming back to like chemical reactions, equilibrium is the point at which forward and reverse reactions happen at the same rate. So it's not like the forward reactions happening more than the backward one or reverse. Equilibrium is like they're both happening at the same rate. And so this is kind of the maximum state of stability. And systems will kind of tend towards equilibrium. Systems will never spontaneously move away from equilibrium. A process is spontaneous and can perform work only when it is moving toward equilibrium. So all of this stuff, again, maybe seems kind of random and out of context, but these concepts of like free energy can be applied to the chemistry of life's processes. So the chemical reactions that happen can be classified based on their free energy changes. So there's two main classifications. Reactions that are exergonic, and then reactions that are endergonic. So if you think about the prefix exer, it's kind of like exo, like outside. So it means energy outward. Exercise. So these reactions have a net release of free energy to the surroundings. Exer, like it's releasing to the outside. And then ender is kind of like endo, meaning inside. So energy inward. These reactions that are endergonic absorb free energy from the surroundings. And so, let's break this down first. Okay, so exergonic reactions, again, exer, kind of like outside, energy outside. In exergonic reactions, the products store less free energy than the reactants. So in this kind of bar graph, this is showing, this is kind of like over time. So the x-axis is progress of the reaction. Y-axis is free energy. So at the beginning, the reactants of this reaction have a high amount of free energy, and then as the reaction happens over time, the products release energy, and then the products themselves don't have as much energy as the reactants. Hopefully that makes sense. So because delta G is negative, exergonic reactions occur spontaneously, so without any input of energy. Again, recall that the term spontaneous means that a reaction is energetically favorable, not that it'll happen fast. The magnitude of that change in delta G determines the maximum amount of work an exergonic reaction can perform. So let me go back. This is the beginning amount of like free energy in the reactants. This is however much was released, and then how much is stored in the products. And then that difference is the change in free energy. So usually that's going to be negative because, yeah, it's going down, right? So the magnitude or how big, how negative it is going to kind of help determine how much work that reaction can end up performing if that energy is going to go to something else. So for each molecule of glucose that gets broken down during cellular respiration, that means there's 686 kilocalories of energy available for work. So remember, calories is a measurement of like how much work can be performed of energy. So yeah, when you break down glucose, you're getting 686 kilocalories of energy, and now that's energy available to do work for cells or digestion or whatever the process is that it's going to power. So that technically means that the chemical products of respiration, so on that graph on the right side, have 686 kilocalories less energy molecule than that bigger bar on the left. Okay, and so the opposite is endergonic reactions. So when you're going to break bonds during a chemical reaction, that doesn't release energy, it actually requires energy. So if the products are of lower free energy than the reactants, then potential energy is released when new bonds are formed after the original bonds break. Yeah, sure. Sure. Okay, so here is basically the opposite, right? Endergonic, so you have to put in energy. So at first, the reactants have like a low amount of free energy. You have to put in energy, and then that difference goes into the products. So in endergonic reactions, the products store more free energy than the reactants. Because delta G is positive, you had to put in energy, then these are non-spontaneous. They're not going to really happen on their own. Yeah. So in this case, the magnitude of delta G determines the quantity of energy required to drive this kind of reaction. So to produce glucose from oxygen, which happens in photosynthesis, this actually requires an input of 686 kilocalories per mole. So for each mole of glucose that you're making, you had to put in 686 kilocalories, which makes sense. It's exactly how much we have after we break down a molecule of glucose. So the products of photosynthesis, making glucose, and then it also makes oxygen, they end up storing 686 kilocalories more free energy per mole than those reactants to build them. And so this reaction is powered by converting light energy to chemical energy. So again, this all seems maybe a little bit like, what? But hopefully it helps as we get more into cell respiration and photosynthesis. So coming back to this, big points. Exergonic reactions have a net release of energy to the surroundings. Endergonic reactions absorb free energy from the surroundings. And so again, there are different kinds of systems. They can be closed, they can be open. So reactions in a closed system, like if this was an isolated hydroelectric system, they will eventually reach equilibrium and then do no work. So like if this system is isolated, there's just this much water that goes in here. This process is going to go forward, but then it's going to reach equilibrium like this, and then without anything else being added, it's just going to stay like this at equilibrium. So without any additional water from the outside of the system, this is going to stay still. And so in a cell, in a living thing, the chemical reactions of metabolism are reversible, but they never reach equilibrium. And so in a cell, like this forward and backward reaction is reversible, but never really at equilibrium, because humans and organisms that are living aren't really closed systems. So it wouldn't be a closed system. And this wouldn't happen. If something reaches equilibrium, it's basically dead. So yeah, chemical reactions of metabolism are reversible but never reach equilibrium. This is one of the defining features of life. So in an open system, like an open hydroelectric system, it's not closed off. You're going to get addition of stuff. So cells actually allow materials to flow in and out, right? It's not a cell that's not permeable at all. The cell is permeable and lives in an environment and has surroundings, whatever. So stuff is going to come in and out. So like in an open hydroelectric system where there is more water, cells do allow materials to flow in and out. And so this flow of material prevents metabolic equilibrium and enables cells to continue doing work. And so that's just one system, even if it's open. But like a multi-step open hydroelectric system, so if there was more than one of these and it was open to each thing, a catabolic pathway in a cell releases free energy in a series of reactions. So in cellular respiration, there's actually a bunch of different reactions. We keep saying that it's just one, cellular respiration, but it's actually a bunch of different reactions. So in cellular respiration, all those reactions are pulled in one direction because the products of one reaction are actually the reactants in the next step. So as one reaction happens, it's kind of pushing forward the next reaction by having the stuff for that reaction there. So in a living organism, a steady inflow of glucose and then release of the waste products ensures that the equilibrium is never reached. So here's a picture kind of showing that example. It's not just one system. There's actually multi-step reactions. And that's the big concept, basically, that hopefully you also get from this whole lecture, is like, it's a bunch of different reactions that help power the ones afterwards. And if you have new glucose and you get rid of the waste products like carbon dioxide that we breathe out, then this system continues. So, a cell does a lot of work, actually. Even though we don't think of them as doing things, they are. So cells do three main kinds of work. There's chemical work, like pushing the endergonic reactions that you have to put energy into. Transport work, so pumping substances across the membranes against the direction of spontaneous movement and active transport. And then also stuff like mechanical work, like when cells that have these structures, like cilia or flagella, that takes energy to move those things. Or contracting muscle cells, that takes energy in a mechanical sense. So cells do a lot of stuff, and that requires energy. And it's not just like free energy. We have to have it in a molecule, basically. So cells manage energy resources to do work through energy coupling, the use of an exergonic process to drive an endergonic one. And so most energy coupling in cells is mediated by this molecule called ATP, which will be the whole focus of the next